There's a castle in North Carolina that cost more than the Empire State Building. 250 rooms, 4 acres of floor space. It should be humming with life. Instead, when you stand in its center, all you hear is your own breathing and something else. Something wrong. The first thing that strikes you about Biltmore Estate is not its beauty, it's the silence. You expect a house this large to produce sound simply by existing. The groan of settling foundations, the whisper of air moving through hallways, the distant echo of footsteps from some other wing. But Biltmore offers none of this. It sits in its valley like a held breath, 4 acres of European ambition transplanted into the Blue Ridge Mountains, and it makes no noise at all. 250 rooms spread across a limestone facade that borrowed from 3 French chateaux. A banquet hall with a 70-foot ceiling. A library that once held 23,000 volumes. An indoor bowling alley, a gymnasium, an indoor pool lined with underwater lighting that was revolutionary for 1895. 65 fireplaces, 43 bathrooms. Technology that made it the most advanced private residence in America. And yet, when you stand in the center of it now, the overwhelming sensation is absence. Not emptiness in the way an abandoned building feels empty. The furniture remains. The tapestries still hang. Every third-floor bedroom keeps its perfectly made bed, waiting for guests who will never arrive because they've been dead for 80 years. The house isn't empty. It's full of everything except purpose. Tour groups move through in careful lines, their voices dropping to whispers without anyone telling them to. The velvet ropes create paths through rooms that were designed for unrestricted movement. You cannot touch the books in the library. You cannot sit in the chairs. You cannot stand too close to the Pellegrini painting in the banquet hall or lean against the mantelpiece that took craftsmen months to carve. The house has become a museum of itself, which means it's no longer a house at all. Outside, the estate unfolds across 8,000 remaining acres. Olmsted's forests, carefully designed to look untouched. Gardens that require a staff of dozens to maintain their impression of effortless abundance. A winery that produces revenue, a hotel, a gift shop, selling miniature replicas of the building you're currently standing in, as if the original weren't already a replica of something else. Biltmore receives over 1 million visitors each year. It generates enough income to sustain itself. By every practical measure, it has survived. But stand in that banquet hall at closing time, after the last tour group has filed out and the lights begin their automated dimming sequence, and ask yourself what, exactly, has survived. Not a home, not a family seat, not even a monument to anything coherent. Something vast and intricate and expensive, designed to last forever, that discovered forever has no use for it. The question isn't why Biltmore feels abandoned. The question is what kind of world builds something like this in the first place? And then what kind of world makes it impossible to keep? America, in the 1890s, existed under a set of economic rules that will never exist again. There was no federal income tax. The Supreme Court had struck down the brief attempt at one in 1894, declaring it unconstitutional. The wealthiest Americans, the industrialists who controlled railroads and oil and steel and banking, paid nothing on their earnings. Not a percentage. Nothing. No estate tax either. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, his $105 million fortune passed to his heirs, without the government taking a cent. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $3 billion today, handed down like silverware. The top 10% of households controlled 90% of the nation's wealth by 1900. 4,000 families, less than 1% of the population, held as much as the remaining 11 million families combined. This wasn't a flaw in the system. This was the system working exactly as designed. Social Darwinism provided the intellectual permission structure. Herbert Spencer's theories, imported from England, argued that wealth accumulation was proof of natural superiority. The rich were rich because they were stronger, smarter, more fit to survive. Assisting the poor, according to Yale professor William Graham Sumner, actually weakened them. Better to let nature take its course. Most Americans didn't benefit from this philosophy. In 1890, 11 million of the nation's 12 million families earned less than $1,200 annually. The average worker made $380 a year, well below what was considered the poverty line even then. They lived in tenements, they worked 12-hour days, their children worked beside them. But a very specific class of Americans, born into shipping fortunes or railroad empires, or inherited financial networks, could do something in the 1890s that would become impossible 20 years later. They could take millions of dollars and spend it on whatever they wanted without oversight, taxation, or public accountability. George Washington Vanderbilt inherited $2 million from his grandfather. He received another $1 million on his 21st birthday. When his father died in 1885, he inherited $5 million more, plus the income from a $5 million trust fund. All of it tax-free, all of it his to deploy as he wished. He chose to spend approximately $6 million building a house in North Carolina. That's roughly $180 million in today's currency, though the comparison fails to capture what that money could command. 1,000 workers, 60 stonemasons, 6 years of continuous construction, materials shipped by private railway, craftsmen imported from Europe, land purchased until it totaled 125,000 acres. This wasn't excess. This was Tuesday for Gilded Age aristocracy. The era had a specific window. It opened after the Civil War, when industrial capitalism exploded without regulatory constraint. It closed with the 16th Amendment in 1913, which made federal income tax constitutional and permanent. For those 50 years, wealth could grow and concentrate and manifest in physical form without the friction of redistribution. Biltmore is what 50 years of unregulated capitalism looks like when it decides to build a summer house. The house exists because a particular alignment of law, philosophy, and economic structure created a 30-year period when a single person could command enough resources to build something that today would require either government funding or corporate backing. George Vanderbilt wasn't uniquely ambitious. He was uniquely situated in a moment when ambition could be expressed in limestone and tapestries without answering to tax collectors, shareholders, or public opinion. That moment ended. The progressive era arrived. Income tax became law, estate taxes followed. The Supreme Court, which once protected concentrated wealth, began allowing its regulation. The rules changed, and houses like Biltmore became impossible not because people stopped wanting them, but because the economic weather shifted. You cannot build Biltmore today, not as a private residence. The money exists. What doesn't exist is a world where that money can be deployed this way without dilution. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the house was only possible during a brief window when inequality reached its most extreme expression, what exactly does its survival celebrate? George Washington Vanderbilt II was born into a dynasty that built railroads and steamship empires, and he wanted nothing to do with either. His brothers ran the family business. Cornelius II took over New York Central Railroad. William K. expanded into shipping and real estate. They attended board meetings, negotiated labor disputes, testified before Congress when regulators came asking uncomfortable questions. They wore their surnames like armor and seemed comfortable with the weight. George collected books. By the time he commissioned Biltmore, he owned more than 20,000 volumes. Philosophy, history, botany, agriculture, art theory, travel narratives. He read fluently in 8 languages and had working knowledge of Hebrew and Sanskrit. He kept detailed journals of what he'd read, annotations in the margins, cross-references between texts. His library wasn't decoration. It was the place he actually lived. Friends and relatives described him as slender, dark-haired, pale, shy. The word appears in every account, not reserved in the way powerful men sometimes perform humility. Actually uncomfortable in crowds, actually happier alone, actually incapable of the performance required at society dinners where his brothers thrived. His father, William Henry Vanderbilt, recognized something fragile in his youngest son and tried to shelter him from the brutality of business. When William Henry died in 1885, He left the bulk of his fortune to Cornelius and William Kay. George received $5 million in cash and another $5 million in trust. A substantial amount, but notably less. The will acknowledged what everyone knew. George wasn't built for empire maintenance, so he turned to the only empire a sensitive, bookish aristocrat could build without destroying his nervous system. Architecture, landscape. The creation of a physical space so complete, it could function as replacement for the social world he found unbearable. Biltmore wasn't an investment. It was a fortress against other people. Consider the floor plan. 250 rooms, but George designed his private quarters to be as far from the main entertaining spaces as possible. His bedroom suite occupied the third floor, accessible by back staircases the guests would never use. His study, lined floor to ceiling with those 20,000 books, sat adjacent. He could retreat there after dinner and simply disappear into text while his wife Edith handled whatever social obligations remained. The house included 34 bedrooms for guests. George rarely invited anyone. He married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898 in Paris, away from the New York society pages. She was intelligent, capable, comfortable with wealth, but not obsessed with status. Most importantly, she understood that her husband had built this enormous house primarily as a mechanism for being left alone. They had one daughter, Cornelia, born in 1900, 3 people living in 250 rooms, attended by a staff trained to be invisible. George spent his days overseeing forestry experiments. He hired Gifford Pinchot to manage scientific forestry programs, making Biltmore the first professionally managed forest in America. He funded the Biltmore School of Forestry. He studied horticulture, animal breeding, agriculture. He walked the estate alone, observing, taking notes, retreating to the library to cross-reference what he'd seen with botanical texts. This was the life he wanted: controlled, quiet, intellectual, no board meetings, no power struggles with family members, no performances of dominance in rooms full of men who measured their worth in tonnage and acreage. But here's the unbearable irony. To achieve this isolation, he had to build something so massive and public that it drew attention from everyone. To retreat from society, he constructed the most famous private residence in America. To live quietly, he created a spectacle. The house cost roughly $6 million, equivalent to $180 million today. Every newspaper covered its construction. Reporters wrote breathless descriptions of the imported tapestries, the Pellegrini ceiling, the 70-foot banquet hall. Photographers captured the facade. The public became fascinated by the mysterious youngest Vanderbilt, who disappeared into the North Carolina mountains to build a castle. George hated all of it. He avoided photographers. He gave almost no interviews. When he had to travel to New York or Washington, he moved quickly, stayed briefly, returned to Asheville as soon as possible. The estate he'd built to escape scrutiny had made him one of the most scrutinized men in America. And even inside his fortress, he couldn't escape what he was. His inheritance funded the estate's operations. His family name opened doors with architects and craftsmen. His social position allowed him to acquire 125,000 acres without meaningful resistance. He existed at the center of a system he found morally exhausting, but lacked the courage to refuse. So he built beautiful things on stolen land and called it sanctuary. He read philosophy while tenant farmers worked soil his money had displaced them from. He studied forestry while logging operations he authorized stripped mountainsides. He collected art while mill workers in his textile operations earned wages that barely covered food. George Washington Vanderbilt II was not a villain. He was something more common and more tragic. A sensitive man born into a position that required brutality, who tried to solve the problem through aesthetics and isolation, and succeeded only in building a monument to his own moral paralysis. The house stands because he couldn't bear to be in the world, and the world made the house possible because it didn't care what he could bear. The land George Vanderbilt wanted wasn't empty. Shiloh sat on the hilltop where Biltmore House would eventually stand. 28 black families, most of them formerly enslaved people, who'd purchased their first property after emancipation. 200 acres total, a church, a school, a cemetery where their dead rested. They'd been there since the 1870s, building, farming, establishing something that looked like permanence. Charles McNamee, Vanderbilt's attorney, made the purchases. He offered $35 per acre when surrounding land sold for $7. Some families accepted immediately, others hesitated. This was the first property they'd ever owned, purchased with money earned after freedom. Selling to a wealthy white man felt like returning to something they'd escaped. Reverend William Logan, a Shiloh community member, helped negotiate. Whether he was protecting his neighbors or enabling their displacement depends on which version of the story you prefer. The families eventually sold. All of them. Vanderbilt paid $1,000 for the church. He financed the relocation of homes, the construction of a new church building, and the exhumation and reburial of bodies from the cemetery. The community reformed 2.5 miles away as New Shiloh, where it exists today. The transactions were legal. The payments exceeded market value. Many Shiloh residents found work constructing the estate, and some descendants still work there. These facts appear in every account, offered as evidence that the displacement was fair, even generous. But fairness and justice aren't measured in dollars per acre. Shiloh families weren't forced at gunpoint. They were forced by economic reality. When the wealthiest man in America wants your land and offers you more money than you've ever seen, refusal isn't actually an option. Not when your alternative is keeping property you can't develop, can't borrow against, can't pass to children with any security. The offer was coercion dressed in generosity. George Vanderbilt needed 125,000 acres to build his vision of controlled wilderness. That required acquiring nearly 700 individual parcels across 4 counties. Most sellers were white farmers whose land had been exhausted by generations of poor agricultural practices. They were glad to sell. But Shiloh wasn't exhausted land. It was a functioning community that happened to occupy the best view in the valley. So it was moved. Not destroyed, not erased. Just relocated to a less scenic spot where it wouldn't interrupt the sightlines from the future chateau's terrace. The graves were dug up carefully. The church was rebuilt with better materials. The community survived, which is supposed to mean the transaction was acceptable. Except survival isn't the same as consent, and compensation isn't the same as justice. On the hilltop where Shiloh once stood, you can still see depressions in the ground, outlines where the cemetery was, ghosts of foundations, if you know to look for them. Most visitors don't. Frederick Law Olmsted arrived at Biltmore in 1888 to find 125,000 acres of exhausted land. The farms Vanderbilt purchased had been worked to collapse. Generations of poor agricultural practices had stripped topsoil, eroded hillsides, and left the woodland thin and damaged. This wasn't pristine wilderness. It was worn-out farmland that had been abandoned because it could no longer produce crops. Olmsted's task was to make it look like it had never been touched. He called for removing poorly formed trees, reforesting eroded areas, and planting 300 acres of white pine by 1891. The approach road, that 3-mile entrance from Biltmore Village to the house, was engineered to feel wild and secluded while being entirely constructed. Every curve, every vista, every apparently natural clearing was planned in advance and executed by crews who reshaped the land to match Olmsted's vision. The result was wilderness as performance. Nature designed to reassure wealthy visitors that their presence wasn't disturbing anything, when in fact their presence was the only reason the landscape existed in this form. Olmsted planted exotic species that weren't invasive at the time, but would later require constant management. He created artificial ponds and waterfalls. He designed the Bass Pond with 2 small islands purely for aesthetic effect. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was actually wild. The forests surrounding the house, the ones that look ancient and untouched in photographs, were restoration projects. Gifford Pinchot, hired to manage scientific forestry, implemented the first comprehensive forest management plan in America. This was genuinely innovative conservation work, but it was conservation in service of creating a private pleasure ground for one man. The irony is precise. Vanderbilt's estate became the birthplace of American forestry and scientific land management. The principles developed at Biltmore by Pinchot and later by Carl Schenck, who founded the Biltmore Forest School in 1898, trained the first generation of professional foresters in the United States. Edith Vanderbilt would eventually sell 86,000 acres to the federal government in 1914, creating what became Pisgah National Forest. But the origin was control dressed as preservation, power reshaping reality to look like reality had never been reshaped. Olmsted wrote to Vanderbilt predicting that when his plans were complete, people would cross the Atlantic to see it. He was right. But what they came to see was a simulation of untouched wilderness that required more human intervention than a working farm. Construction began in 1889. A 3-mile railroad spur was built from Biltmore Village to the building site. A brick kiln was constructed on the esplanade, producing 32,000 bricks daily. A woodworking factory materialized. The construction site became its own industrial city. 1,000 workers, 60 stonemasons, 6 years of continuous labor. Almost 10 million pounds of Indiana limestone arrived by rail. 132,000 board feet of oak. Marble from Europe for the interior floors and the fountain sculptures. The materials alone required logistical coordination that rivaled military campaigns. And when the house was finished, it required 80 servants to function. This is the part that photographs don't capture. The hidden corridors built into the walls. The concealed doors designed to blend seamlessly with wood paneling and tapestries. The service passages that allowed staff to move through the house without being seen by family or guests. In the breakfast room, a door behind one of the Renoir portraits led to the butler's pantry. Servants could enter with hot meals, serve, and disappear without crossing the family's sightlines. Dumb waiters connected the basement kitchens to dining areas on upper floors. Meals traveled up through mechanical lifts, eliminating the need for servants to use the main staircases. The winter garden, with its tropical plants and marble floor, concealed trapdoors that opened to the sub-basement, where potted plants were stored and rotated seasonally. Staff could swap out vegetation without guests noticing the machinery behind the eternal spring. George Vanderbilt's bedroom suite occupied the 3rd floor, accessible by back staircases. His study sat adjacent, lined with 20,000 books. Even in his own house, he designed escape routes from socialization. The house functioned as a self-contained system. Electricity from the beginning, though initially direct current because of Vanderbilt's friendship with Thomas Edison, forced air heating. Centrally controlled clocks, fire alarms, a call bell system that allowed family members to summon staff from any room without raising their voices. 6 separate sections divided by brick firewalls, because electricity was dangerous, and fire was a constant threat. This wasn't a home. It was an organism engineered for maximum comfort, while rendering the labor required for that comfort invisible. The family experienced seamless luxury. The staff experienced architectural erasure. You lived in the house, or you lived in its walls. There was no in-between. The genius of Richard Morris Hunt's design was making servitude architecturally elegant. Every convenience required a corresponding hidden mechanism. Every moment of leisure depended on someone else's movement through spaces designed to deny their existence. The house still contains these passages. Tour groups don't see them. They walk through the banquet hall and the library and the winter garden, admiring the 70-foot ceilings and the Pellegrini paintings and the hand-tooled Spanish leather. They don't see the narrow corridors behind the tapestries where people worked 12-hour days, maintaining the illusion of effortless grandeur. Human beings made secondary to systems, comfort built on disappearance. The machine worked perfectly, until it didn't. Christmas Eve, 1895. 27 Vanderbilt family members gathered in a house that wasn't quite finished. The music room sat empty. The secondary staircases remained incomplete. The dome above the grand staircase had been plastered just 6 days earlier. But George Vanderbilt, perfectionist by nature, decided the moment had come. His mother Maria Louisa presided as hostess. George was still unmarried, still most eligible, still uncomfortable in the role of entertaining. But he'd built this fortress against the world. And now the world, at least the small portion of it he could tolerate, was invited inside. A 40-foot spruce stood in the banquet hall, decorated with electric lights, an innovation most Americans had never seen. Estate workers and their families received gifts the next day. George stood by the front door in formal tails, handing out oranges and candy, playing the role of benevolent aristocrat, while probably wishing he could retreat to the library. 3 years later, he married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in Paris, a 15-minute civil ceremony followed by a religious service. Simple, modest, away from American newspapers. She was 10 years younger, intelligent, comfortable with his need for solitude. They honeymooned in Italy and returned to Biltmore, where estate employees lined the approach road holding a horseshoe made of goldenrod flowers. They had one daughter, Cornelia, born in 1900 in the Louis XV room, 3 people living in 250 rooms. In 1912, they booked passage on Titanic's maiden voyage. Edith's sister insisted maiden voyages were dangerous. Too many things could go wrong on an untested ship. George and Edith switched to Olympic, departing earlier. Their footman, Edwin Wheeler, stayed aboard Titanic with their luggage. He died when the ship sank, 26 years old. An orphan from Bath who'd finally secured stable employment with one of America's wealthiest families. The Vanderbilts survived. Wheeler didn't. This is how proximity to wealth works. The protected stay protected until they don't, and the servants absorb the risks. George lived 2 more years. In 1914, he died in Washington from complications following an emergency appendectomy. 51 years old. He'd spent 6 years building the house and 17 years living in it. Edith inherited everything. The estate, the debt, the impossible task of maintaining a structure designed for a world that was already ending. The rules that made Biltmore possible started dying the year before George did. February 3, 1913. Wyoming became the 36th state to ratify the 16th Amendment. The Constitution now permitted federal income tax without apportionment among states. Congress wasted no time. By October, they'd passed the Revenue Act of 1913, establishing a 1% tax on personal income over $3,000, with a maximum rate of 6% on incomes above $500,000. For the first time in American history, wealth accumulation faced systematic friction. The change was modest at first. Less than 1% of Americans earned enough to pay anything. The Vanderbilt fortune could easily absorb a 1% tax, but the precedent mattered more than the rate. The door had opened. Progressive reformers had spent 2 decades arguing that concentrated wealth threatened democracy, and they'd finally secured the constitutional mechanism to redistribute it. The estate tax would follow in 1916. Corporate taxes increased steadily. The top marginal income tax rate would reach 77% by 1918 to fund the war effort. Even after wartime rates decreased, they never returned to pre-amendment levels. The era of unrestricted capital accumulation had ended. George Vanderbilt didn't live to see most of this. He died March 6, 1914 in Washington, about 10 days after an appendectomy. A pulmonary embolism, 51 years old. He'd spent 6 years building the house and 17 years living in it. He never finished all the rooms. The music room sat incomplete. Secondary staircases remained unbuilt. Parts of the estate existed only as architectural drawings that would never be executed. His death was sudden enough that Edith and Cornelia weren't at his bedside. They were at Biltmore. The news reached them by telegram. Funeral services were held at Bethlehem Chapel in Washington Cathedral. Then his body was transported to the Vanderbilt family mausoleum in Staten Island. He left everything to Edith: 250 rooms, 125,000 acres, 80 servants, a dairy operation, farms, forests. The most expensive private residence in America, designed to function as a self-contained system that required constant maintenance and generated almost no income. And he left her debt. George had been withdrawing from capital to maintain operations. The estate's annual expenses exceeded its revenue. Bad investments had depleted portions of the inheritance. The house itself, that $6 million monument to isolation and refinement, produced nothing except bills. Edith was 41 years old. Her daughter Cornelia was 13. Neither had been trained to manage an enterprise of this scale. George had handled everything, retreating to his study with ledgers and correspondence, keeping the machinery running through sheer force of inherited wealth and obsessive attention to detail. Now the machinery was Edith's problem, and the world was changing its relationship to private fortunes. She began making decisions immediately. The Biltmore Nursery, one of the estate's few commercial operations, had been under consideration for downsizing. George's death accelerated those conversations. The Biltmore Herbarium, a collection of botanical specimens, was being prepared for donation to a local educational institution. Estate operations were being reviewed for potential cuts. Then the flood came. July 16, 1916. Two tropical storms, one after another, dumped catastrophic rainfall across western North Carolina. The French Broad River, which runs through the Biltmore property, rose 21 feet, 17 feet above flood stage. The normally shallow river became 1,300 feet wide. Water reached 9 feet deep at the estate's entrance. Biltmore Village, the model community George had built for estate workers, was submerged. All Souls Church, the cathedral he'd commissioned, filled with water. Beds floated in the hospital. People drowned while clinging to trees, waiting for rescue that couldn't reach them through the floodwaters. The Biltmore Nursery, located at the confluence of the French Broad and Swannanoa rivers, was completely destroyed. 85% of the nursery stock was lost. 3/4 of the Biltmore Herbarium was ruined. Rare botanical volumes from George's library were damaged beyond repair. The nursery had been one of the top operations of its kind in North America. It supplied plants and trees to estates across the country. The North Carolina governor's mansion had received shrubs for beautification. Tuskegee University had received roses and sequoia trees. The commercial operation generated revenue and employed specialists in horticulture and botany. The flood ended all of that. Chauncey Beadle, the estate superintendent who'd managed the nursery, surveyed the damage and knew immediately that the operation couldn't be rebuilt. Not at that scale. Not with the resources Edith had available. The main house survived, the forests remained, the dairy could continue. But the most productive commercial arm of the estate had been eliminated by weather, and with it went any realistic hope that Biltmore could function as a self-sustaining enterprise the way George had envisioned. This was the inheritance Edith faced. A house that cost more to maintain than it could ever generate. Land that produced some revenue but nothing approaching what was needed. Staff who depended on their employment. A 13-year-old daughter who would eventually inherit all of it. And a federal government that was actively changing the rules about how much of this wealth she could keep. The 16th Amendment meant that future generations of Vanderbilts would pay taxes on their inheritance. The estate tax, passed in 1916, meant that when Edith died, the government would claim a portion of everything she left to Cornelia. And the progressive increase in income tax rates meant that the estate's operating losses couldn't be easily offset by outside income the way George had managed. Biltmore had been designed for a world where private capital could accumulate without friction and be deployed without oversight. That world no longer existed. Edith made the only decision that made sense. In 1916, shortly after the flood, she began negotiations to sell 86,000 acres to the United States Forest Service. George had always planned to make this sale eventually. He'd been interested in conservation, in scientific forestry, in creating something lasting beyond private ownership. Gifford Pinchot's work at Biltmore had led directly to the establishment of professional forestry in America. The Biltmore Forest School had trained the first generation of American foresters. But George had imagined making this donation from a position of strength, as a philanthropic gesture. Edith was making it from necessity. The government paid $5 per acre, 86,000 acres for $430,000. That was far below market value, but Edith couldn't afford to wait for better terms. The sale created the core of what would become Pisgah National Forest, fulfilling George's conservation vision while simultaneously saving the estate from immediate financial collapse. It also represented an acknowledgement of reality. The era when one family could own 125,000 acres as a private pleasure ground was over. The estate shrank to what could actually be maintained. Edith would continue selling land as finances demanded over the next decade, reducing the property to roughly 12,000 acres by 1930. The irony was precise. George had built Biltmore as a refuge from the industrial capitalism that had created his wealth. He designed it to function according to principles of scientific management, self-sufficiency, and aesthetic perfection. He'd imagined it lasting for generations, a permanent monument to cultivation and taste. But capitalism doesn't respect aesthetic intentions. Markets don't care about architectural beauty, and when the rules governing capital accumulation changed, the house discovered that it couldn't survive on beauty alone. The Progressive Era, reforms that enabled income and estate taxes, weren't targeting the Vanderbilts specifically. They were restructuring the relationship between private wealth and public welfare. The reformers who fought for these amendments believed that extreme inequality threatened democratic governance, and they used constitutional mechanisms to redistribute resources. Biltmore was collateral damage in a larger transformation. The house had been built during a brief window when American capitalism operated without meaningful constraint. The 16th Amendment closed that window. And estates like Biltmore, which required enormous capital to maintain but generated minimal economic value, couldn't survive the new friction. George had spent $6 million building a house that would require millions more to maintain indefinitely. He'd assumed the wealth would always be there because wealth had always been there. His grandfather had died the richest man in America. His father had doubled that fortune. The Vanderbilt name meant permanence. But empires don't die from drama. They die from policy changes, tax restructuring, and the slow erosion of the conditions that allowed them to exist in the first place. Edith understood this in a way George never had to. He'd lived his entire life in the Gilded Age, when wealth could be inherited and deployed without interference. She'd been widowed in the Progressive Era, when the government had decided that unlimited private fortunes were incompatible with democratic values. She did what she could. She sold land, she reduced staff, she maintained the house itself and the immediate grounds. She made sure Cornelia received the best education available. She continued George's conservation work, not out of idealism but because the Forest Service purchase provided desperately needed cash. And she survived. The house survived. But it survived as something fundamentally different from what George had intended. Not a private refuge, not a self-sustaining estate, not a permanent family seat that would pass through generations. It survived as a problem waiting for someone to solve it. Cornelia would inherit that problem in 1925, when she turned 21 and gained legal control of the estate. By then, the house had been operating at a loss for 11 years. The Great Depression was 5 years away. The world that had built Biltmore was gone, and the world that remained had no idea what to do with a 250-room mansion that existed primarily to demonstrate that such things had once been possible. The income tax didn't destroy Biltmore. George's death didn't destroy it. The flood didn't destroy it. But taken together, these events revealed something fundamental. The house had always been impossible. It had only appeared possible because it was built during a brief moment when impossibility could be financed without consequence. That moment ended. The house remained. Those two facts would define everything that followed. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was born in the Louis XV room on August 22, 1900. The society pages celebrated her arrival as if royalty had been born. The Spartanburg Journal called her a new star at Biltmore. Local newspapers reported her weight, her health, her first smile, as though the nation had a right to know. She was the only child of the largest private residence in America, heir to 125,000 acres, future inheritor of a fortune that would make her one of the wealthiest women in the country. And she spent her childhood playing with the children of estate workers, attending school in Biltmore Village, living inside a monument that her father had built as a fortress against exactly the kind of public attention her birth received. George doted on her. Photographs show him holding infant Cornelia on the loggia, smiling in a way he rarely did for cameras. He read to her in the library. He walked the estate with her, pointing out trees and plants, explaining forestry principles to a toddler who probably just wanted to chase the St. Bernards. Then he died. March 6, 1914. Cornelia was 13. She went from being the daughter of a living legend to being the heiress of a rapidly decaying empire. Edith managed the financial collapse, while Cornelia attended Miss Madeira's School for Girls in Washington, splitting her time between Asheville and the capital, never quite belonging to either place. At 21, she received an annuity of $2 million. At 25, she inherited the principal sum of $5 million. Money that should have guaranteed freedom instead arrived as a trap disguised as inheritance. April 29, 1924. All Souls Cathedral in Biltmore Village. Cornelia married John Francis Amherst Cecil, first Secretary of the British Embassy, descendant of Lord Burghley who'd served as High Treasurer to Queen Elizabeth I. He was 10 years older, aristocratic, proper. The wedding drew 500 guests to the ceremony and 2,500 to the reception at Biltmore House. The Asheville Citizen described it as the social event of the decade. Photographers captured every detail. The organist Charles Henry Galloway traveled from St. Louis to play. Cornelia wore a gown that cost more than most families earned in a year. The house was open to strangers who came to witness American aristocracy performing European rituals in the North Carolina mountains. She was 23 years old, marrying a man she'd met in Washington society, committing herself to the estate that had consumed her father and financially devastated her mother. The marriage looked like a fairy tale from the outside. Inside, it was a business arrangement between two people trying to solve the problem of Biltmore's survival. They had two sons, George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil, born February 27, 1925, in the same Louis XV room where Cornelia had been born. William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil, born August 17, 1928, also in that room. Both births were reported in newspapers. Both boys were photographed, catalogued, presented to the public as evidence that the Vanderbilt dynasty would continue. Cornelia painted the Halloween room in the basement. December 1925. 3 weeks of work with John and friends, creating murals of witches and black cats and wooden soldiers inspired by La Chauve-Souris, the Russian cabaret troupe that had toured America. They threw a New Year's Eve party. 100 guests descended into the basement to find cauldrons and fires and theatrical sets that transformed the sub-basement into something unrecognizable. It was the best party some of them had ever attended. It was also Cornelia, trying desperately to create something that wasn't her father's vision, something weird and modern, and deliberately wrong for a house that demanded European refinement and historical weight. The Halloween room is the only part of Biltmore that carries her mark. Everything else was George's dream, Edith's maintenance, Hunt's architecture, Olmsted's landscape. That basement room with its deliberately creepy murals, its rejection of elegance in favor of avant-garde Russian theater, its commitment to making guests uncomfortable, was Cornelia saying the only thing she could say inside a house that allowed no dissent. "This place is a tomb and I'm being buried in it." 1930. The Great Depression had destroyed what remained of the estate's finances. Cornelia and John, at the request of the city of Asheville, opened Biltmore House to paying guests. Admission was $2. Strangers walked through the rooms where she'd grown up, staring at her childhood furniture, touching surfaces her father had selected, turning her inheritance into a museum while she was still living in it. The Biltmore Company was formed in 1932 to manage operations. The house was no longer a home. It was a business that happened to contain bedrooms where people still slept. Cornelia found the arrangement unbearable. Around 1932, she left for New York City, officially to study art, actually to escape. She left her husband to manage the estate. She left her sons, still children, in the care of staff. She fled the only home she'd ever known because staying meant suffocating. By 1934, she was in Paris, divorced from John Cecil, hair dyed bright pink, going by the name Nilcha, a rejection of the Vanderbilt surname and everything it represented. She never returned to Biltmore, not once, not for holidays, not for her sons' weddings, Not when the estate stabilized financially. Not when her mother died in 1958. She erased it from her life as completely as Shiloh had been erased from the hilltop. She lived in Europe for 42 years. She remarried in 1949 to Captain Vivian Francis Bulkley Johnson, a British veteran who'd served in the Imperial War Cabinet during World War I. They lived quietly in Oxfordshire on a farm called The Mount. No publicity, no society pages, no obligation to perform her inheritance for strangers. When Bulkley Johnson died in 1968, Cornelia was 70. She met William Robert Goodsir in a London restaurant. He was her waiter. He was 26 years younger. They fell in love. She married him in 1972. This is what freedom looked like for Cornelia Vanderbilt. A farm in England, a husband who'd never heard of Biltmore when they met, a life built on the deliberate destruction of everything her name was supposed to mean. She died February 7, 1976, in Oxford, 75 years old. Her ashes were placed at a church near the Mount. When Goodsir died in 1984, her ashes were placed on top of his casket and buried with him in St. Peter's Churchyard, South Ronaldsay, Orkney Islands. Not in North Carolina, not in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum in Staten Island, not anywhere near the estate she'd inherited and abandoned. Her sons, George and William, inherited Biltmore. They divided it according to their interests. George took Biltmore Farms, the more profitable dairy and agricultural operations. William inherited the house itself, the money pit their grandfather had built and their mother had fled. William dedicated his life to saving it. He modernized operations, expanded tourism, added a winery and hotel. He transformed Biltmore from a failing monument into a financially sustainable historic site that now receives over 1 million visitors annually. He died in October 2017, having spent 60 years solving the problem his grandfather created and his mother refused to inherit. Cornelia never saw any of it. She left in 1934, when the house was struggling and there was no guarantee it would survive another decade. She stayed away through World War II, when the National Gallery stored paintings in the music room. She stayed away through the estate's financial resurrection. She stayed away through everything. People call this abandonment. Her sons, publicly at least, maintained polite silence about their mother's departure. The Biltmore Company mentions her wedding and her role in opening the house to tourism, then skips to her death without explaining the 42-year gap in between. But abandonment suggests she had an obligation to stay. And the question Cornelia's life asks is simpler and more devastating. What exactly was she supposed to inherit? A house too large to live in, land acquired through displacement, a fortune that had already been eroded by taxes and bad investments, a surname that attracted photographers and journalists wherever she went, 250 rooms that had become a museum of someone else's vision, a marriage arranged to preserve an estate she'd never asked for, sons who would inherit the same trap. Cornelia's 21st birthday party was attended by 250 estate workers and tenants at 7 in the morning. They improvised a band. They celebrated the young woman they'd watched grow up, the heiress who would now legally control everything. The fancy dress ball that night drew hundreds in elaborate costumes. Cornelia appeared in a closed sedan chair, drew back the curtains, stepped forward dressed as a page from the French Renaissance. The entire performance of aristocracy, executed perfectly because she'd been trained for it since birth. And somewhere inside that performance was a young woman who'd lost her father at 13, watched her mother struggle to save the estate, and was now expected to dedicate her life to maintaining a monument to 19th century excess, in an era that had rejected everything it represented. She tried. She married the right man. She had the required children. She opened the house to tourism. She played her role for 8 years. Then she stopped. The Halloween room remains. Those murals of witches and bats and theatrical chaos, painted in a basement where servants once worked invisible shifts. It's the only permanent mark Cornelia left on Biltmore. Not elegant, not refined, deliberately strange, intentionally uncomfortable, committed to disrupting the aesthetic perfection her father had demanded. It's a message written in paint on brick walls. A rejection letter composed years before she had the courage to actually leave. The house demanded one thing, she created its opposite. And when that wasn't enough, when the murals weren't sufficient protest, she dyed her hair pink and disappeared into Europe. Sanity for Cornelia required refusal, not partial rejection, complete erasure. She didn't move away from Biltmore. She moved to a different continent and changed her name, and married a man young enough to guarantee that he'd never known her as Cornelia Vanderbilt, heir to American aristocracy. She built a life where her past was something she chose not to mention, rather than something she was required to perform. The estate survives because William accepted the inheritance she rejected. He spent his life transforming the house into something financially viable. He succeeded. Biltmore is now a profitable enterprise that preserves George Vanderbilt's vision for anyone willing to pay admission. But Cornelia's rejection stands as the alternative verdict. The house may have survived, but at what cost to the people trapped inside it? George built it and died young trying to maintain it. Edith inherited it and spent decades fighting financial collapse. Cornelia escaped it and never looked back. William saved it by turning it into something his grandfather never intended. 4 generations, 4 different relationships to the same structure. Only one of them found peace, and she did it by walking away and staying away until death guaranteed she'd never have to return. The house remains. Cornelia is buried in Scotland, her ashes mixed with those of a waiter she married at 72. That's the inheritance she chose, not Biltmore, not the Vanderbilt name. Not the obligation to preserve something beautiful that was built on displaced communities and Gilded Age inequality, just freedom, finally. In a church cemetery on the Orkney Islands, about as far from North Carolina as it's possible to be while staying on Earth. January 1942. A snowstorm in the middle of the night. A train carrying 62 paintings and 17 sculptures arriving at Biltmore Estate under armed guard. Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington, Rembrandt's self-portrait from 1659, Raphael's Alba Madonna, Titian's Venus with a Mirror, works by Van Dyck, Velázquez, Pellegrini. The National Gallery of Art's most valuable masterpieces, evacuated from Washington in case German submarines actually made it to the capital. David Finley, the gallery's director, had visited Biltmore as Edith's guest in the 1920s. He remembered it as fireproof, remote, and large enough to store priceless art. When Pearl Harbor made an attack on American soil feel imminent, he called Edith and asked if the nation's cultural treasures could hide in her house. She said yes immediately. The music room, the one space George never finished, became a vault. Steel doors installed in the archways, steel bars on the windows, curtains hung to conceal the security measures, fire extinguishers, alarms, steel racks for hanging paintings, armed guards rotating in shifts around the clock. The estate was still open to tourists. About 1,000 visitors annually walked through the house, unaware that some of the most valuable paintings in Western civilization sat behind curtained doorways, 15 feet from the velvet ropes. The art stayed for 2 years. Curators from the National Gallery lived on site, monitoring temperature and humidity, checking for damage. In October 1944, when the threat of attack diminished, the paintings returned to Washington with motorcycle escorts and sirens. The irony is so perfect it hurts. George built Biltmore to retreat from public life and create a private sanctuary for beauty and learning. His library of 20,000 books, his collection of tapestries and paintings, his obsessive acquisition of European art, all designed to construct a world where aesthetic perfection could exist without interference. 27 years after his death, the house he built to protect beauty from the world was protecting the world's beauty from destruction. The music room he never finished became a fortress for art that belonged to everyone. The estate he designed as rejection of public obligation temporarily became the nation's most important cultural bunker. And it worked because the house was empty, because George's family was gone, because the private refuge had already failed as a private refuge and transformed into something else. What saved the art was that Biltmore had already stopped being a home. Cornelia opened the estate to tourists in 1930 at Asheville's request. The Great Depression had devastated the region. City officials begged her to help boost employment through tourism, Admission was $2. Visitors walked through rooms where she'd grown up, staring at furniture her father had selected, turning her childhood into a museum exhibit while she still lived there. She lasted 4 years before fleeing to Europe and never returning. The Biltmore Company was formed in 1932 to manage operations. Not a family managing an estate, a corporation managing a property. The distinction matters. Corporations don't have nostalgia, they have balance sheets. The house closed during World War II, from 1943 to 1946, due to wartime rationing, but the art stayed protected until 1944. When Biltmore reopened in 1946, it did so with a clearer understanding of what it actually was. Not a residence, a tourist attraction that happened to contain historically significant architecture. William Cecil understood this better than anyone. He returned from his banking career in New York in 1960 to save the family home. The house was losing $250,000 annually. The dairy operation that had subsidized it for decades was becoming unprofitable. Rooms sat in disrepair. There was no money for restoration. William spent 35 years turning Biltmore into something his grandfather never intended: a profitable business, a self-sustaining enterprise, a brand. He modernized operations, expanded marketing, added audio tours, raised admission prices from $2.50 to amounts that could actually support restoration. He experimented with everything. Raised mushrooms, grew salad tomatoes, offered landscaping services to outsiders, did whatever generated revenue. In 1968, 8 years after his arrival, Biltmore made its first significant profit, $16.34. It was enough to prove the model worked. He added a winery in 1985, converting the old dairy barn into a production facility, hired a French winemaster, created the first commercial winery on an American estate. The wine became another revenue stream, another reason for people to visit, another way to monetize the property. Then came the inn on Biltmore Estate in 2001, a 4-star hotel, then Village Hotel, then Antler Hill Village with restaurants, shops, event venues. The estate became a destination resort that happened to include a historic house, rather than a historic house that happened to allow visitors. William died in October 2017, 89 years old. He'd spent 60 years solving the problem his grandfather created. He succeeded by abandoning every principle George held sacred. George built Biltmore as refuge from commercialization. William saved it through aggressive commercialization. George designed it for privacy. William opened every door. George filled it with books and art for personal enrichment. William filled it with tourists who paid admission to photograph rooms they'd never be allowed to touch. The house survives. Over 1 million visitors annually. Revenue in the hundreds of millions. A major employer in Western North Carolina. A preservation success story that gets referenced whenever anyone talks about saving historic properties. But stand in that banquet hall now, at closing time, after the last tour group has filed out. The same 70-foot ceiling, the same Pellegrini painting overhead, the same 16th century tapestries, the same walnut paneling and triple fireplace and Germanic flags. Exactly as George designed it, perfectly preserved, completely dead. Not physically dead, maintained better than when George lived here. The restoration work William funded brought everything back to original condition. The colors are brighter, the wood is polished. The tapestries have been conserved. But there's no one reading in the library. No one studying forestry reports in the private quarters. No family dinners in the breakfast room. No quiet afternoons in the winter garden. No children sliding down banisters or playing with St. Bernards. The house functions perfectly as a museum of itself, which means it no longer functions as what it was built to be. This is the verdict Biltmore delivers. You can save the building, you cannot save its purpose. George built it to retreat from a world that demanded constant performance of wealth and status. The house survives by performing wealth and status for paying audiences 7 days a week. He built it as private sanctuary. It survives as public spectacle. He designed it to last forever as a family seat. It lasts by accepting that it stopped being a family seat 80 years ago. The only person who understood this clearly enough to act on it was Cornelia. She saw that the house had become a tomb and that staying meant being buried alive. So she left, changed her name, dyed her hair pink, married a waiter in London, died in Scotland, and asked to be buried there, as far from North Carolina as she could manage while remaining on the same planet. Her rejection stands as the clearest judgment. The house may be beautiful, it may be historically significant, it may generate economic value for the region, but it's uninhabitable in any meaningful sense. Not because the plumbing doesn't work, because the weight of maintaining it crushes anyone who tries to live inside its requirements. William spent 60 years carrying that weight. He succeeded. The house stands, tours run daily, the winery produces award-winning vintages, the hotels stay booked. By every measurable metric, Biltmore is a triumph of historic preservation and adaptive reuse. But adaptive reuse requires admitting that the original use is dead. George built this house to contain a life. A quiet life of reading and forestry and controlled beauty. A life protected from public scrutiny and commercial pressure. A life that required displacing Shiloh and acquiring 125,000 acres and spending $6 million 19th century dollars. That life lasted 17 years, from 1895 to 1914. George's entire occupancy, one lifetime in a house designed to serve generations. Everything since has been aftermath. Edith struggling with debt, Cornelia fleeing, William commercializing, the current generation managing a tourism business that happens to involve a historic structure. The house succeeded at being a house for exactly as long as George lived. The moment he died, it started becoming something else. A problem, a burden, an asset, a business, a museum. Anything except what it was built to be. This is what happens when you build permanence during a temporary window. The window closes, the permanence remains, and the remaining structure becomes a monument to the impossibility of its own existence. Biltmore teaches us that beauty, scale, and craft cannot overcome structural impossibility. George built something that could only exist under specific economic and social conditions. When those conditions ended, the house didn't crumble. It just stopped making sense. Old money survived at Biltmore by selling the memory of old money. The estate generates revenue by letting people walk through rooms where wealth once lived, unbothered by taxation or accountability. Visitors pay to see what unlimited capital could build during a 30-year window when the rules allowed it. They're not visiting a house. They're visiting the fossil of an economic system that no longer exists. And the fossil is magnificent, no question. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The architecture is breathtaking. The attention to detail is obsessive. Every element George selected, from the Pellegrini ceiling to the hidden servant corridors to the controlled wilderness outside, represents the absolute peak of what private wealth could accomplish. But peaks don't justify the systems that made them possible. Biltmore is beautiful. It's also built on displacement, inequality, and a brief moment when concentrated wealth faced no meaningful constraint. Both things are true. The house is worth preserving. The world that made it possible is worth never recreating. So you walk through the banquet hall. You admire the 70-foot ceiling and the triple fireplace. You photograph the tapestries. You listen to the audio tour, explain the paintings and the German flags and the history of the Vanderbilt family. And then you leave. You exit through the gift shop where you can buy miniature replicas of the building you just toured, as if the original weren't already a replica of 3 different French chateaux. You drive down Olmsted's carefully designed approach road, through forests that were destroyed and replanted to look natural. You pass the spot where Shiloh once stood, unmarked, except for depressions in the ground that most visitors never notice. You've experienced Biltmore. You've seen something genuinely remarkable. You've walked through 250 rooms of obsessive craftsmanship and European artistry transplanted into the Blue Ridge Mountains. But you haven't experienced what George built it for. That ended in 1914. Everything since has been commentary. Preservation, yes. Admirable, absolutely. But commentary. The house remains. The life it was built to contain is gone. That gap between what stands and what's lost is where Biltmore actually lives now. In the silence, in the emptiness, in the unbearable perfection of rooms that will never again serve their intended purpose. A castle in North Carolina, 250 rooms, 4 acres of floor space, the most expensive private residence ever built in America. Beautiful, impossible, perfectly preserved, completely abandoned by everyone who understood what it was actually for. The ultimate achievement of Gilded Age ambition, surviving only because it agreed to become a museum of the era that killed it. If this story made you see Biltmore differently, or if you're now questioning what other beautiful things were built on uncomfortable foundations, hit that like button and subscribe. We're uncovering the stories behind America's most famous places, the ones they don't put on the plaques. You won't want to miss what we're exposing next.